Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Very Short History of the Israel-Palestine Conflict by Ilan Pappe, narrated by Jonathan Todd Ross. Introduction. Since the 7th of October 2023, when Hamas stormed into Israel in Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, the world's eyes have been on a country in which there seems to be no agreement, not even on name. Israelis call this land Eretz Israel. Palestinians call it Palestine. On the 7th of October, roughly 1,200 Israelis, the majority of them civilians, lost their lives, and 240 were taken hostage, many of them yet to return home. Israel's retribution, Operation Swords of Iron, has killed over 30,000 Palestinians so far. Roughly a third were children. What follows is a concise history of how this came to be, for those who are seeing the conflict unfold for the first time, as well as for those who have been engaged in activism for peace and justice in the region for many years. The conflict didn't start on the 7th of October. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, when condemning the horrors perpetrated by Hamas, reminded the world that Palestinians have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation following Israel's victory in the Six-Day War in 1967. But the roots go further back than that, even deeper into the past than the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. Its beginnings can be found in the late 19th century. The history, like everything else, has become disputed, obscured by powerful political interests and polarization on both sides. But I am a historian, and to provide context is not the same as making excuses. Starting from when the first Jewish settlers arrived in historical Palestine to our present day, I want to shed light on the major events, personalities, and processes to explain why this conflict has become so intractable. I make no claims to being comprehensive. There is a vast literature spanning decades for those interested in delving deeper into the issue. But I believe anyone who stands against oppression and injustice can understand the fundamentals of what we now know as the Israel-Palestine conflict. This book is my attempt to make it legible. Chapter 1. When and where did the conflict begin? The short answer is in the late 19th century, back when Palestine was once more under Ottoman rule, as it had been since 1516, excepting some brief interregnums. It is estimated that by the end of the 19th century around 500,000 people lived there, within 3 districts of the Ottoman Empire: Nablus, Acre, and Jerusalem. The 3 districts stretched more or less over the area that today is Israel and the occupied territories. About 70% of the people were Muslims, while there were sizable Christian and Jewish minorities. Travelers and diplomats around the world marked the land on their maps as Palestine, and described its people as the Arabs of Palestine. Its inhabitants spoke in their own Arabic dialect and had their own customs, including richly embroidered clothing, denoting village and tribal affiliation. But Palestine was changing, like the rest of the world, between the 1830s and the end of that century. The 19th century was the age of nationalism, and Palestine was not immune. Its urban elites, like those in Damascus, Damietta, or Beirut, revived their interest in Arabic literature and culture, forming a national identity from shared language. Intellectuals advocated for a new pan-Arab unification project, stretching from Morocco to Iraq, and from Syria to Yemen and the Sudan. Nascent pan-Arab sentiment gained popularity after the rise of the Young Ottomans, a reform movement that sought to impose a Turkish national identity upon the entire empire, 2/3 of which was Arab. The 1876 Ottoman Constitution, a victory for the Young Ottomans, declared Turkish to be the only official state language. Arab subjects, including Palestinians, rightly bristled at this attempt at cultural colonization. These trends would only intensify when the young Ottomans' ideological successors, the Young Turks, took power in 1908. The birth of a modern Palestinian identity coincided with a vibrant cultural renaissance, with pioneering writers, poets, and journalists taking the lead, such as Rui al-Khalidi and Najib Nasser, to mention but two of them. In those days it used to be said that the good books were written in Cairo, printed in Beirut, and read in Jaffa. Palestine has never been separate from the Arab world. It is an integral part of it. It has also clearly never been a land without a people, as Zionists took to saying, ripe for the taking. Alongside this cultural transformation, the Ottoman Empire in its dying days modernized the country. In Jerusalem and Nablus, new local governments were established, with reformist administrations. In the early 20th century, plans were proposed and agreements were signed to build tram lines, provide electric lighting, and repair old sewage systems. Provincial towns in this vision would become modern cities. However, the outbreak of the First World War meant that many of these grand ambitions remained on paper only. At the same time as Palestine stood on the cusp of a new era, Zionism appeared in Palestine. Zionism came as a foreign import. In the 16th century, it got its start as an evangelical Christian project in Europe. A significant number of Protestant Christians believed that the return of Jewish people to Zion would fulfill God's promises to the Jews in the Old Testament. This would be a harbinger of the second coming of Christ, marking the beginning of the end of the world, a process many evangelicals wanted to speed up. They were the first to regard the Jews as members of a nation or a race, instead of practicing believers of a faith. They were particularly active in the USA and Britain, and some of them sat in high office, people such as William Blackstone in the USA and Lord Shaftesbury in Britain. What motivated them? Certainly not any sympathy for Jewish people. Some were outright anti-Semites, seeing Palestine as a dumping ground for Jews in the US, Britain, and Europe, as they never accepted them as equal members of their respective nations. But it was also politically convenient, especially for those who were part of the governing elites. Jews, in their eyes, could be mobilized on religious grounds, to take the Holy Land, as they described Palestine, from the hands of the Muslims, that is, the Ottoman Empire, which had been frustrating European imperialist designs in that region. Jewish intellectuals and activists took some inspiration from this movement, regardless of the cynicism of its motives. The Christian fundamentalists of today, referred to as Christian Zionists in the USA, still subscribe to these ideas and are the most important pro-Israeli lobby in the USA, not only offering support to Israel, but going further, backing Israel's annexation and Judaization of the occupied West Bank. However, we should be careful to differentiate Christian Zionism from Jewish Zionism. Jewish Zionism was driven by two impulses. It was firstly a response to the rise of violent anti-Semitism in Eastern and Central Europe, up to and including pogroms costing hundreds of lives. Europe has always had a problem with anti-Semitism. For centuries, Christians condemned Jews as the killers of Christ, and added on various atrocities on top, such as the infamous blood libel. By the late 19th century, the fervor of modern nationalism led to the portrayal of Jews as a separate nation within a nation, intolerable and not to be trusted. But Zionism was not the instinctive answer to surging anti-Semitism at the time. In fact, it was not even popular at first. Suggesting a group who have spent centuries in Europe transplant themselves en masse to a hot, dry land several thousand miles away with a language they don't speak is quite a hard sell. Thousands of Jewish workers organized themselves into socialist movements, believing revolution and the overthrow of the capitalist system would put an end to their oppression as Jews. Other Jews, undoubtedly thinking of the arbitrary brutality of the Tsar of the Russian Empire, held the view that building strong liberal democracies would offer opportunities for Jews to become full and equal citizens, thereby solving the Jewish question. The Holocaust shattered faith in these visions. After the death of over 6 million Jews, and years where concentration camp survivors languished in displaced persons camps, with no European country willing to take them in, safety in formerly Nazi-occupied Europe no longer seemed possible. Only then did Zionism as a movement win genuine widespread support across the Jewish world. The second impulse was nationalism. At the turn of the century, many groupings in Europe, under the yoke of large, unwieldy empires like that of Russia and Austro-Hungary, began to organize themselves as national movements, fighting for the restoration of lost rights. And so there were demands for national cultural autonomy from Poland, Ukraine, Czechia, Serbia, and many more ethno-linguistic collectives. Jewish intellectuals saw the national framework as a means of modernizing Jewish identity. To bring it bang up to date, so to speak, it meant reviving the ancient Hebrew language and rereading the religious texts of Judaism as political ones, the most important of these being the Old Testament. Unlike Orthodox Jews, the secular Zionists, like evangelical Christians, began to interpret the Old Testament as a historical document that showed that Palestine belonged to the Jewish people. Orthodox Jews regarded the Old Testament as a religious and moral tract compelling them to obey God's laws for humanity. After a particularly vicious wave of pogroms in 1881 across the southwest of the Russian Empire, a group of young Jews made plans to settle in Palestine, hoping their zeal and purpose would inspire others to follow their example. They arrived in Palestine in 1882. They were able to buy land in Palestine with money provided by Jewish philanthropists and businessmen, such as the Rothschilds. The land they bought was mostly owned by absentee landlords, that is, rich people who lived outside of Palestine, who had purchased land from the Ottoman state after reforms in Ottoman land law in the mid-19th century. Before these reforms, individuals generally couldn't own land as private property in the Ottoman Empire. It was leased by the empire to landlords or farmers who built their villages on it. Many of these villages had been there for centuries. In Palestine, some of these villages even predated the existence of the empire. But under the new land regime, the village's land, previously leased from the state, was now the private property of a landlord. However, in the Ottoman understanding, the fact of land changing hands didn't alter anything in practical terms. The land, it was understood, came with the tenants attached, that is, the villagers and their villages. As the first Zionist settlers wanted to form their own agricultural collectives, their initial purchases were of uncultivated land, where largely no one lived. This would change when British rule commenced after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, as we will see later. The Zionist movement appealed to the British rulers of Mandatory Palestine to disregard the Ottoman custom. They demanded that the British recognize that land ownership meant they had the right to evict Palestinian villagers. The first Zionist settlers landing in Jaffa in the summer of 1882 had no idea about farming. They were mostly former university students, brought up in East European towns with no instinct for agriculture. They needed the assistance of Palestinian farmers who taught them how to till and plow the land to make it bear fruit. Even then, the leader of that first group, Israel Belkind, never adjusted to farming work and spent his life as an itinerant teacher. These Palestinian farmers no doubt thought they were saving clueless young idealists from almost certain starvation, and probably had no inkling of how the Zionist project perceived them. But even in early Zionist propaganda, Palestinians were portrayed as aliens in their own native land at best, and at worst, as the appropriators of land that had rightfully belonged to Jewish people since the time of the Old Testament. Even at this stage, Zionist thinkers did not simply see the movement towards Palestine as a desperate escape from anti-Semitism in Europe. They saw it as laying the groundwork for taking over Palestine. By the end of Ottoman rule in 1918, Jewish settlers were about 5 to 6% of the population. They were still a minority, but an organized one. Concurrent with developments in Palestine, Zionists in Europe began to propagandize for a Jewish homeland in the corridors of power, essentially doing government diplomacy. These efforts were spearheaded by Theodor Herzl, an Austrian Jew, a journalist, and a playwright, who has gone down in history as one of the founding fathers and driving forces of the modern Zionist project. He sought to consolidate a clearer political structure as a means to achieve Zionist aims. For that purpose, he convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, which adopted a program of establishing a home in Palestine for the Jewish people. The program made no mention of what would happen to the Palestinians if such a home was built. However, Herzl clearly wasn't optimistic about peaceful coexistence. In his diaries in 1895, he expressed hope that the penniless population, that is, poor Palestinians, ought to be spirited away over the borders to neighboring countries. Herzl anticipated that the Ottoman Empire, under pressure from European powers, would be willing to give Palestine to the Zionist movement. He even offered money, which he did not really have, to the Ottoman government in return for such an arrangement. But the Ottomans refused. The dream receding before his eyes, Herzl changed tack and suggested to the British government that the Jewish state didn't have to be in Palestine. It could be in Uganda, then controlled by the British. The British government was open to negotiation on this, but when Herzl presented it at the 1903 Zionist Congress, it nearly prompted a split in the movement. Herzl's health was failing by this point, and he passed away in 1904. He is buried in what is now Israel, resting forever in a land he only visited once in his life. In 1905, the Zionist Congress definitively rejected the Uganda scheme. From now on, the Jewish homeland would be in Palestine or nowhere. The other leading Zionist ideologues, such as David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Usishkin, had little concern for government approval, whether of the British or the Ottomans. In their diaries, it becomes apparent that even in the first phase of Zionist colonization of Palestine, 1882 to 1918, they were already imagining a Palestine without the Palestinians, and openly discussed how that could be achieved. Unlike Herzl, who felt no particular affection for Palestine as a place, they also settled in Palestine themselves. The international legitimacy so vigorously pursued by Herzl did not matter so much to them. For them, the priority was establishing facts on the ground. Everything else would follow from that. Chaim Weizmann succeeded Herzl as the leader of the official Zionist movement. He was a Russian émigré to Manchester, England. When he took over the leadership of the movement, he understood that his role was to build a strong pro-Zionist lobby both in Britain and in the USA. A lobby was needed because no matter how many times propagandists insisted Palestine was empty, it evidently wasn't. He needed to build a lobbying force that could persuade Britain to disregard the aspirations of native Palestinians and assist in establishing a Jewish state there. This would be sold to the British as a bulwark against the Ottoman Empire, a European outpost in the Middle East. The outbreak of the First World War made this task a lot more difficult. Britain's main ally in the Arab world was the Hashemite dynasty. The Hashemites ruled the two holiest places in Islam, Mecca and Medina. In 1916, they were persuaded to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, then fighting alongside Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the promise by Britain that the Arab territories under Ottoman rule would be given to them as representatives of the pan-Arab national movement. These territories included Palestine. If Britain had intended to be true to its word, the modern history of the Middle East would be entirely different. But during the First World War, Weizmann began to build connections between the Zionist movement and the British government. He correctly assessed that Britain was critical for the future of Palestine. Britain was already looking ahead to the end of the war, and the presumed demise of the Ottoman Empire, carving up a new map of the Middle East. Palestine would play a vital part in protecting British imperial interests in the region. Weizmann built a pro-Zionist lobby in Britain made up of pious Christians who believed in the return of the Jews to Palestine as fulfillment of God's will, anti-Semites who wanted Jews out of Britain, and Anglo-Jewish aristocrats who would have been loath to immigrate to Palestine themselves, but saw it as a suitable destination for working-class East European Jews, whom they thought of as being communist troublemakers. In other words, the only thing these people had in common was wanting to establish a Jewish state. It took 2 years, between 1915 and 1917, for the Zionist lobby to persuade the British government that a Jewish Palestine would be a strategic asset for the empire. What tipped the scales for Britain was the realization that Palestine could be critical in defending the Suez Canal in Egypt. A friendly governmental regime there was hence vital. So the imperialists wanted Palestine for strategic reasons, Christian evangelicals wanted it to help bring about the end times, and the Jewish leadership wanted it as a safe haven for the Jews of Russia, as well as a means of forcefully modernizing Judaism. To survive the new epoch, they thought, Jewishness had to be a nationality, not a religion. On the 2nd of November 1917, the British government made the Balfour Declaration, promising to make Palestine a national home for the Jewish people, while protecting the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, that is, the indigenous majority. This declaration was in fact a letter penned by the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to the unofficial leader of the Anglo-Jewish community, Lord Rothschild. Arthur Balfour did not make this promise out of any concern for Jewish people's welfare. As Prime Minister in 1905, he in fact pushed for the 1905 Aliens Act, immigration restrictions designed to prevent East European Jews from arriving in Britain. Diverting Jews fleeing persecution to Palestine, a land he was equally unconcerned about, seemed to be the ideal solution. Britain, alongside France and the U.S., emerged as the victor of the First World War. This alliance could now carve up the territories of the fallen Ottoman Empire as they pleased. To give this a veneer of international legitimacy, the victors founded the League of Nations, in principle, an international organization committed to maintaining peace across the world. Here, the mandatory system was devised in which the League of Nations granted a member state a mandate to govern a former colony, or an area that previously belonged to the defeated empire. This was intended as a compromise between Britain and France, who saw their triumphs as a chance to expand their empires, and the U.S., whose president, Woodrow Wilson, had declared himself in favor of the other nationalities in the Ottoman Empire having an absolutely unmolested opportunity of autonomous development. In theory, the mandated territories of the former Ottoman Empire were only meant to benefit from Allied administration until they could stand alone, and they were recognized as on their way to full independence. Iraq, for instance, became independent by 1932, Lebanon followed in 1943, and Syria was granted independence in 1946. Only Palestine was the odd one out, a direct consequence of Britain's old promise in the Balfour Declaration. By the end of 1918, Britain had completed its occupation of historical Palestine, what we now know as Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Palestine was now under British military rule. In 1922, the League of Nations granted Palestine official status as a British mandate, although Britain had been de facto governing it as a mandate for 2 years. The mandate agreed by the League echoed the wording of the Balfour Declaration, directing the British to secure the establishment of a Jewish national home and facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. The British attempted to replicate the structure they had applied in their other mandates. At the head of a mandatory country stood the High Commissioner from the mandatory power. There was then a government and parliament composed of the mandate's own inhabitants, with some limited powers, but very closely supervised by the advisers deployed by the European mandatory power. But it was impossible for Britain to build this model in Palestine. Britain got as far as appointing a High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, but forming a government proved much more difficult. Neither side was happy with the British proposals. The Palestinians rejected a legislative council that was tied to acceptance of the Balfour Declaration, and one in which they would always be outvoted. They also rejected all proposals for an Arab agency analogous to the Jewish Agency for Managing Immigration, as effectively treating them as a minority in their own country. And so, after agreement could not be reached, all powers, both executive and legislative, would be the realm of the High Commissioner and his office. At the start of the British Mandate, Jews constituted roughly 11% of the population. But they had been promised Palestine as their future home by the League of Nations and in the Constitution for Palestine drafted by the British. During the years of British rule, the British government tried to manufacture Palestinian consent to losing their own country by offering solutions like partition, federation, and forming a binational state. They did not offer to respect the mandatory principle that the majority of the people in a country have the right to decide its future, as happened in all the neighboring Arab countries. And even when the Palestinian leadership was willing to countenance accepting the presence of Jewish settlers in a future Palestine, Britain did not dare to impose on the Zionist movement any solution that did not include a Jewish state over part or the whole of Palestine. Chapter 2. The Quiet Years, 1918 to 26. Palestinians did not intend for their country to be handed over, in whole or in part, to recent Jewish immigrants on the basis of diplomatic agreements they had no say in. Between 1918 and 1920, during British military rule, Palestinian thinkers and activists began to organize in Muslim Christian associations. These were formed to advocate for self-government and to oppose the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. By 1919, these organizations had grouped together under the banner of the Palestine Arab Congress. The very existence of the Palestine Arab Congress dispels two myths often propagated by those who don't know any better: that the conflict is one between Muslims and Jews, and that Palestine had no national identity of its own before 1948. Since the beginning of the Palestinian national movement, Christians have played a crucial role in it. As early as 1911, two Orthodox Christian cousins launched the newspaper Palestine, championing an Arab Palestine and raising early alarm about Zionist ambitions. This should give us pause for thought, as even today a common Israeli narrative insists that Palestine has no history of nationalism prior to Israel's founding. In 1972, the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir famously said, "There is no such thing as the Palestinian people." Too many Israelis still echo that sentiment today. The years 1918 to 20 also saw the birth of a new Palestinian civil society, including political organizations, youth clubs, and Arab newspapers. These groups also came together as part of the Palestine Arab Congress, functioning as the Palestinians' representative body. At the start of 1919, as the Paris Peace Conference was ongoing, this Congress convened and called for the renunciation of the Balfour Declaration. They saw Palestine as part of an independent Arab Syria. But as we can see, there was unity across religious lines against the attempt at carving out a new state. The British responded to these developments by creating their own institutions. In December 1921, the High Commissioner Herbert Samuel established the Supreme Muslim Council, which would have a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?